You ever love someone so deeply that you don't even keep track of what you've given up, because in your mind, it's all worth it? That was me. From the very first day, I told myself I'd move mountains for her, and I did. I sold everything I owned, my properties, my investments, even my father's old car that he left me before he died. Every signature on those sale documents felt like carving a piece of myself away, but I kept telling myself it was for a greater purpose. For her. Before I continue the story, kindly like, subscribe and tell us where you're listening from. You see, she was brilliant. Not just ordinary smart, I mean the kind of brilliance that could light up a whole room and silence every conversation when she spoke. She had dreams bigger than our little corner of the city, dreams of rising above, of making history, of becoming the best. And I believed in those dreams like they were my own. I didn't just support her, I supported her family too. Paid the bills, stocked their fridge, handled their emergencies. I became the invisible backbone of her entire household. It wasn't easy. Some nights I worked until my body gave out. Other nights, I sat in darkness because the electricity bill had eaten the last coin out of my pocket. But whenever she smiled at me, whenever she whispered thank you after passing a mock exam, it was all worth it. At least, that's what I told myself. And then it happened. She aced the nationwide special exams, not just passed, not just ranked high, but became the best student in the entire country. When they announced her name on the news, my chest swelled with pride so hard I thought my ribs would crack. I wanted to scream it from the rooftops, that's my girl. All those sacrifices, every sleepless night, every tear I swallowed, they had finally paid off. I remember sitting on the rooftop that night, staring at the stars like they were confetti falling just for us. I imagined the future so vividly, the two of us in our own home, framed certificates on the wall, maybe a little boy who had her sharp eyes and my stubbornness. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to believe I had made the right gamble. That I hadn't thrown away my life, I had built us one. But you know what life loves to do. It waits until your guard is down, until your hands are open wide in celebration, and then it drops the blade. It was just after midnight when the phone rang. Her name flashed on the screen. I smiled, thinking she wanted to celebrate with me, maybe whisper her excitement the way she always did. But the voice that greeted me wasn't the woman I knew. It was colder. Sharper. I want you to stay away from me, she said. No explanation. No hesitation. Just those words, cut clean like glass. I laughed at first, thought it was a joke. But then she added, don't call me again. Don't come near me. And just like that, the line went dead. I sat there in the silence, the phone pressed against my ear long after the call had ended. Do you know what silence feels like when it's heavy enough to crush you? It's not peaceful. It's not calming. It's suffocating. Every tick of the clock that night sounded like a hammer on my skull. I tried calling back. No answer. I sent her a message. No reply. I even sent flowers the next morning with a note that read, I'm proud of you. They were returned the same day, unopened. Tell me, how do you swallow that? How do you digest the fact that everything you've built, every sacrifice you made, every dream you fueled, is suddenly dismissed with a single phone call? For days, I wandered like a ghost in my own life. Work didn't matter anymore. Food tasted like sand. My friends told me to forget her, but they hadn't seen the blood I poured into making her who she had become. Forget her? How do you forget your own fingerprints on someone's success? I started asking myself dangerous questions. Who was she seeing behind my back? Had I been nothing but a stepping stone? Did she ever love me at all, or was I just a sponsor, a convenient provider until she reached the top? Each question was a knife. Each thought drew blood. And slowly, the man who once sacrificed everything began to die, replaced by someone else, someone who wanted answers, someone who wanted justice. No, not justice, something darker. Because if she thought she could erase me like chalk on a board, she had no idea what I was capable of. And that night, as the silence grew heavier, I made myself a promise. If she wanted distance, I would give it to her. But not before leaving her with something she would never forget. That was the beginning of the reckoning. Have you ever tried screaming into a void? That's what my life became after her call. A void. I dialed her number countless times, watched it ring until it died, left messages that were swallowed whole by silence. Days bled into nights, nights into weeks, and the only constant was that suffocating emptiness. At first, I thought it was temporary, maybe stress, maybe pressure from her family, maybe something I didn't yet understand. I told myself she'd come back, that she just needed space. But as the days dragged on, it became painfully clear, she wasn't coming back. Not willingly. Her family, the same family I had fed, clothed, and supported, suddenly treated me like a stranger. Doors that were once open slammed shut in my face. Calls to her mother went unanswered. Her brother, who used to beg me for transport money, looked at me in public like I was a disease. The betrayal wasn't just hers, it was collective, a conspiracy of silence. I began to unravel. Nights were the worst. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, and replay that call over and over again in my mind. Stay away. Don't call me again. The words weren't just a rejection, they were an erasure. As though I never existed in her story. As though my sacrifices, my love, my dreams were nothing but ash she could blow away with a breath. And in that silence, questions began to breed like insects. Was there another man? Was I just a tool, a sponsor to carry her and her family until she reached the pedestal? Did she ever love me, or was she rehearsing her betrayal all along? Those questions clawed at me, day after day. They turned me into someone I didn't recognize. I stopped eating properly, stopped caring for myself. I'd stare at her pictures, the ones I hadn't yet gathered the strength to burn, and I'd feel rage rise in me like a tide. A rage so consuming it frightened me. But here's the thing, I didn't want to lash out blindly. No. I wanted precision. I wanted her to feel every ounce of humiliation, every shard of betrayal, every drop of pain that was coursing through me. If I had been erased, then I would write myself back into her story in a way that could never be deleted. And so, I started watching. Observing. Planning. She was preparing for her graduation ceremony, the biggest day of her life, the day the entire country would celebrate her brilliance. The newspapers, the cameras, the professors, the dignitaries, everyone would be watching her. And I thought, what better stage for truth to come alive? But before I could strike, I had to be sure. I needed to know what, or who, she had traded me for. So I dug. Quietly, carefully. I followed the whispers, the subtle shifts in her social media, the faces that appeared beside hers in group photos. I became a shadow, slipping into places I didn't belong, listening to conversations never meant for me. And what I discovered, it broke whatever pieces of me were still intact. She wasn't just done with me. She was ashamed of me. To her new circle, I wasn't her backbone, her supporter, her savior. No. I was the fool. The man who had poured everything into her only to be discarded when she reached the top. They laughed at me, those whispers carried in bars, in restaurants, in hushed tones at the back of lecture halls. I wasn't her partner. I was her sponsor. That was the word they used. The humiliation burned deeper than any blade. And in that moment, something inside me hardened. I stopped being the man who loved her. I became the man who would make her pay. But understand this, I wasn't going to use my fists. No, fists heal too quickly. I wanted something permanent. Something unforgettable. I wanted her standing in that graduation hall, her crown of glory shining, when suddenly the entire facade would collapse around her. I wanted to tear the mask from her face in front of the very people she had chosen over me. And so, I started laying the groundwork. Collecting the evidence. Making quiet arrangements. Pulling strings that no one could see until it was too late. Piece by piece, I built the blueprint of her downfall. You see, silence can destroy a man, but it can also forge him into something unrecognizable. The silence she left me in became the fire that tempered my resolve. And by the time the graduation day approached, I wasn't broken anymore. I wasn't weak. I was sharpened steel, ready to strike. The storm was coming. And she had no idea she was standing directly in its path. If there's one thing life teaches you when it breaks you, it's how to become quiet in the right ways. You stop shouting. You stop making mistakes that come from haste. You learn to think 3 moves ahead, to see the grooves that people sleepwalk into, and to place your foot so the whole dance changes direction. That's what I became, quiet, patient, and terribly deliberate. You need to understand something about me, I wasn't a stranger to plans. Running businesses teaches you to anticipate risk, to build contingencies, to read people. Those skills weren't lost when I sold everything. They were sharpened by humiliation. I turned those tools inward and began to map out a route back into her life, not to beg, not to plead, but to force a reckoning that could not be ignored. First, I decided what kind of revenge I wanted. This was important. I refused to be petty. I wanted a result that was precise and public, something that would peel back the glossy photos and speeches and show the truth as a contrast too stark to explain away. I wanted her to wake in the middle of her triumph and understand how thin the applause really was. So I made rules. No violence. No threats. No lies constructed from whole cloth. I would use things that already existed, testimony, timing, and the one currency no one in that crowd could resist, reputation. If her story had been built with other people's trust, then it could be dismantled by the same. The first step was observation. I watched her world like a man watching a theater stage. I learned the rhythms of the institutions that celebrated her, who admired her publicly and who whispered in private. I paid attention to patterns, the professors who touted her brilliance, the journalists who wanted a feel-good piece, the friends who stood on the sidelines smiling. Those faces would be the audience. I needed an entrance that would catch them off guard. I also needed proof. Not the kind you could forge and later be exposed for, that would have been hollow. I wanted things with weight, statements, corroborating voices, little contradictions between what she said in private and what she presented in public. I collected those things the way a photographer collects negatives, patiently, carefully, without destroying the subjects. Sometimes it meant revisiting conversations she had carelessly left in public places, sometimes it meant listening where others had already spoken and were willing, if persuaded, to say more. There were people who wanted to help. Some out of spite for how she treated me, a few former friends whose loyalty had evaporated the moment her success rose. Others out of obligation, a quiet sympathy for the man they'd seen given everything. I approached them laterally, never demanding, always offering them a role that would expose the truth without making them targets. These alliances were fragile, they required tending. But when someone finally agreed to say what they'd seen, or to confirm the casual rumor that had once been laughed off as jealousy, it added weight. Timing, above all, was my weapon. You don't embarrass someone by chance, you embarrass them by choice. Graduation was the obvious stage, the cameras, the guests, the pride-thick air. It was the day when applause would be loudest and the fall would be most visible. But I needed the collapse to be undeniable. Something whispered, taken alone, could be dismissed. It had to be a pattern, multiple voices, multiple small truths that, when joined, became a roar. So I stitched together the pattern. A former study partner who had grown tired of being minimized stepped forward quietly and confirmed certain lies about shared work. A supplier who'd been paid by her family, paid by me in the old days, admitted to favors requested on her behalf. A thread of messages she'd once flippantly posted to a private group became a public testament when an insider agreed to share them. None of this was showy. It was surgical. Each piece fit into the next like teeth in a gear. There were practicalities too. I had to be invisible in execution. I could not be the man who walked up the aisle and screamed, that would have made me just another figure in the crowd. The best revenge is the kind people remember long after the actor is forgotten. So I positioned myself where I could see everything without being seen. I made sure that those who carried the truth were where they could not be ignored. I arranged for the precise moment when a whisper could be amplified into a public claim. And I rehearsed the faces I would make. You think that's ridiculous? It isn't. When you're going to watch someone collapse, you want the vantage point of a man who has considered whether he will feel vindicated or hollow. I practiced remaining calm. I practiced looking like a spectator, like any man who had come to celebrate, because that would make the aftermath less about me and more about the contradiction in her life. There was one risk I kept at the forefront of my mind: collateral damage. I had loved people around her, friends who had been my friends too. I didn't want to ruin lives unnecessarily. That complicated things. I took extra care to make sure that the consequences fell primarily on the one who had chosen to erase me. That's why I refused to drag in unrelated scandals or to exploit tragedies that had nothing to do with the betrayal. My mission was honest in a strange, brutal way: expose what had always been there, and leave the rest untouched. The final days before the ceremony were a fevered calm. I checked and rechecked the small dominoes I'd set. I met again with the few brave voices who had agreed to speak up when the moment came. I listened to their fears and soothed them. I rehearsed the contingency plans in case something went wrong. There are few things more terrifying than building a public truth and watching it balance on so many fragile threads. But terror can be useful, it keeps you sharp. On the morning of the graduation, the city felt different to me. It was loud, bright, full of expectation. People dressed in their Sunday best, cameras warmed up, and proud parents hunched over programs like men guarding treasure. She moved through the crowd with the effortless smile of someone used to being adored. They handed her bouquets. They hugged her. There was a bubble around her, a kind of immunity that wealth and achievement create. I took my place in the balcony and watched that bubble with the clinical eye of a surgeon. The moment would come between the chancellor's speech and the applause, a slender window where attention collects and can be redirected. I could feel it, the hush after the name is called, the rustle of programs. All the pieces were set. There's a peculiar calm that precedes a storm. People pretend life is ordinary while the stage is being reset. I felt that calm like an omen. I breathed in the heavy, sharp air and promised myself one last thing: whatever happened next, I would own the truth of it. Not to boast, not to gloat, but to watch, as from a distance, the world decide what weight my sacrifices had carried after all. The game was ready. All that remained was the move. You ever notice how a room can hold two truths at once? In there, under the chandeliers and the polite laughter, one truth was glossy and rehearsed: the speeches, the bouquets, the proud parent hugging their child like they'd won something themselves. The other truth was a slow-moving freight train I'd set on a different track. Both occupied the same space, and for a little while, both seemed possible. Then the train hit. The ceremony began with all the usual theater. The chancellor read from a speech thick with platitudes. Old professors pinned medals with hands that trembled in public composure. Cameras found angles that made every graduate look like history in the making. She glided across the stage like she'd been carved for this moment. When they read her name, the hall appeared to inhale at once: applause, camera shutters, the rustle of dreams on glossy paper. I watched from the balcony like a man watching his own funeral procession, except this time it was her crown I wore in my head. I could feel the breath of the crowd, the heat of pride that follows achievement. It was beautiful and enraging in equal measure. Beautiful because the world believed in her, enraging because it believed a lie. Timing matters in these things. You don't drop a bomb in the middle of a sermon and expect people to understand. You place a question, a fact, a contradiction, in the exact rhythm when attention is already captive, and the mind finishes the rest for you. I had arranged for 3 voices to break the hush in sequence, small at first, then a rising tide. Each was careful, legal, and irrefutable in its own way. Together they were a mosaic that showed a different face of the woman the audience had come to celebrate. It started with a whisper at the back, soft at first, like someone clearing their throat. People turned, curious. Then another voice, firmer, a former study partner who had been coached to state what he knew: that some of the work credited to her had been shared, duplicated, or passed off, that there were patterns in timelines that didn't add up. He spoke calmly, with the kind of slow diction that makes doubt bloom. Heads tilted. Phones lifted. The second voice came quicker, carrying names, receipts, the quiet confirmation that favors had been traded. Not illegal in the criminal sense, but ethically rotten to the core. A small cluster of parents exchanged looks. Professors tightened their grips on programs. Cameras, sensing a story, angled for reaction. The applause that had just been waiting to start thinned, like a tide pulling back from a shoreline. The final piece was the one that cleaved the room. A former insider, someone who'd been there during late-night group chats and casual boasts, stood and read messages that were never meant for public consumption. They were short, embarrassed, and perfectly human, the kind of comments people write in private and forget. But in the light of the hall, with scores of witnesses and the press assembled, those private notes took on new dress. They became evidence of a pattern of entitlement, of a cultivated image at odds with the messy truth. It was surgical. It was merciless. And it left no comfortable place for anyone to stand. I watched the color drain from her face like paint run under a hose. For a moment, time slowed and every tiny motion became loud, the rustle of the gown, the click of a heel, a hand groping for a program as if it could anchor her. Her lips moved, forming nothing that the microphone could carry. She looked at the chancellor, as if he could control the weather. He looked back with the same puzzled expression as the rest of them, because how often does a ceremony become a trial in the space between awards? Panic is a small, precise animal. It makes people bleak and honest in the way fear does. You see the real shape of them. Her friends clustered close, but not in comfort, in calculation. Their eyes flicked outward, searching for escape routes. Her family, the same ones I'd fed through years of struggle, looked as if someone had renounced them publicly. They shifted, guilt and disbelief flickering across their faces. The cameras, sensing the unraveling, grew ravenous. They liked a hero, but they adored a scandal. And the crowd, that's where the real cruelty happened. People are weirdly generous with judgment when they feel they're standing on the right side. Conversations that had been praising her moments before turned poisonous within minutes, whispers became sentences, sentences became verdicts. Old rivalries resurfaced like ghosts. Some parents clutched their children closer. Others smiled to anyone who would look at them and found, with relief, that they themselves had not been deceived. I felt something cold and unfamiliar settle in my chest. It wasn't joy. It wasn't triumph. It was awe at how swiftly a persona could collapse under the weight of small, true things. I had expected a shout, a proclamation of innocence, maybe outrage. Instead, she became a study in collapse, a smile that didn't reach the eyes, hands that trembled, breath that came in small, uneven pulls. The crowd didn't know how to grieve the illusion they'd loved. She left the stage like someone leaving a room with all the lights going out. People parted for her not with sympathy, but with the calculated discomfort of the polite who wished to look away. I followed her with my eyes until she disappeared behind the curtains and into the labyrinth of back rooms and back doors. I could have gone after her, perhaps to gloat or to confront. But that wasn't the point. My work had been to expose a truth, the rest was the world's reaction to it. A private meeting between cause and consequence. Later, behind closed doors, hysteria and apology braided together in a way only close families understand. I watched from images on the feeds and from witnesses who had stepped forward to text me in the aftermath. She cried, she raged, she asked questions that had no answers. Her mother, who once embraced me like kin, now spoke in defensive, clipped sentences. Her brother avoided calls. I heard about threats of legal action, empty in their fury, because there was little legal ground to stand on when the truth was in public messages and corroboration. Outside, the comments sections ignited. The internet is a slaughterhouse of sympathy and scorn, and within hours, there were think pieces, hot takes, and late-night jokes. Her name trended in a way I had never wished for. She was famous for a different reason now, not for brilliance, but for the collapse that followed the revelation. People who'd once read feel-good profiles now scrolled articles with the steady, prurient interest only humans seem able to feel at other people's undoings. I won't pretend I didn't savor some of it. To deny that would be dishonest. There was a bitter sweetness in watching those who had cheered her now search for the words to explain themselves. But I also knew what revenge does that victory never tells you: it rearranges the inner geography of a man. It takes something out of you and leaves a cavern where warmth used to be. That night, long after the cameras had gone and the hall's lights hummed into sleep, I sat alone and listened to the echo of what I had set in motion. It was quieter than I expected. No fanfare, no anthem of victory, just the small, careful counting of what had been done and what had yet to come. Because exposure is only the beginning. After the fall, there are ruins to walk through, consequences to meet, and the smallest, cruelest truth: humiliation can break a life, but it can also begin an entirely new one. And as I stared at the phone, the messages lighting the screen with public outrage and private betrayal, I felt the weight of one more truth: something had shifted, in her, yes, but in me as well. Chapter 5 would demand something I hadn't been ready to face: the aftermath, the cost, and whether the reckoning I'd engineered could ever fix what had been irreparably damaged. You ever watch a fire burn down to embers and think you'll feel relief when it's finally over? I thought that, too, until the smoke settled and I realized I'd burned a map that led nowhere. The truth I'd set loose at the graduation did exactly what I wanted: it exposed her, cracked the mask, and let the world judge. But consequences are not neat endings. They are messy, pervasive things that crawl into corners you didn't intend to touch. In the days after, the city moved around a new center of gravity: her downfall. Journalists chased the story like sharks to a scent. Professors issued statements with the precise language of institutional detachment. Friends who'd once toasted her success sent terse messages, mouths suddenly full of civility that could not disguise the calculation behind the words. Her family retreated into a shell of shame and defensiveness, and the house I'd once stalked felt like a place I'd once owned in another life. People wanted to know why I had done it. A few of them, strangers in comment sections and a couple of old friends, imagined me as a villain who lurked in the wings. Others tried to fit me into a hero costume. He exposed fraud, they said, as if being the instrument of exposure is the same thing as being righteous. Neither description held the weight of what had really happened. The truth is, I wanted an accounting. But there's a difference between wanting someone to be honest and wanting to break them. I had convinced myself the latter was justice. The thing about conviction is how quickly it can become a justification. I watched the pieces tumble and told myself it was worth it. I told myself that dignity, once stained, deserved removal. Her life, predictably, didn't fold into an immediate ruin the moment the cameras left. That's a story the internet loves: collapse in an instant, but reality moves more slowly. She lost sponsorships and invitations. A few academic opportunities evaporated on polite emails. The university convened a committee, papers were re-examined, some of her accolades were, at best, questioned. People I'd hoped would speak for decency stayed quiet, and the ones who had once cheered were suddenly very good at looking away. She fought back at first, not with legal fury, there was little ground for that, but with an animal insistence that she was more than the messy pieces the world had been shown. She apologized to people who mattered to her, begged for chances to explain, and tried to stitch the torn parts back together. I watched, often through the tiny, detached thrill of learning the next headline before anyone else. But the thrill grew thin quickly, like cheap champagne gone flat. Her mother called me once in those early weeks. It was a short call, the kind that feels like someone testing a door to see if it will open. There was anger in her voice, but it was the angry fatigue of someone who'd been forced into a position they never chose. "You had no right," she said, and I listened to the accusation as if it were a verdict. I could have answered with the list of betrayals, the whispered jokes, the returned flowers. Instead, I said nothing. Saying nothing felt like an answer itself, clean, cold, and final. There were practical ripples I hadn't fully imagined. People I once did business with stepped away, not because I'd been revealed, but because scandal is contagious and nobody wants to be near the infection. I found doors closed in places I had once opened with a key. The man who'd sold his property for love discovered his economy had consequences beyond the romantic. My life required rebuilding now as much as hers did. Only my losses were quieter, less public. No one wrote think pieces about the man who'd arranged the exposure and then had to survive its aftershocks. And then there was the strangest consequence of all, the hollowing out. You build a plan around a fantasy, oh, if they just see the truth, everything will right itself, and when the plan succeeds, you can feel the vacuum left by the thing you expected to fill you. I had imagined standing on the rubble, victorious and whole. Instead, I stood on it and understood the cost. The warmth left me in fractions. I had taken something from her and found there wasn't enough of it to make me warm. The months that followed were a collage of small, inglorious moves. She disappeared from the limelight for a while, resurfaced with quieter ambitions, and accepted that some doors would not open again. There were apologies, and there were ruptures that never mended. A few of her closest friends severed ties entirely, others stayed but became cautious, the way people treat glassware that survived a fall. For myself, the aftermath demanded a reckoning I hadn't foreseen. Revenge is easy to romanticize in the dark, an answer, a return. But the real work was asking whether what I had done aligned with the man I wanted to be. I found, to my discomfort, that the answer shifted depending on the hour. Some mornings I told myself I'd done the right thing, other nights I felt like a vandal who'd carved his initials into someone else's life. There were moments, small and sharp, when regret flared. I saw her walking past a market carrying a bag of rice and something like recognition flickered, not for me, but for the shared life we once planned. I remembered the nights I'd sat on leaky roofs imagining curtains that didn't rattle. Those memories did not absolve me. They only complicated the ledger. People asked if I would do it again. It's a question that expects either bravado or denial. The honest answer is a sliver: I cannot unmake what I made. I cannot unring the bell I rang in that hall. I can only choose what comes next. And what comes next is not glamour. It is slow rebuilding, of reputation, perhaps, or of a life that is less defined by grand gestures and more by small, steady pieces. In the end, the reckoning was not a single moment but a slow process of learning where cruelty ends and consequence begins. She rebuilt, as people do, but with different hands and a different kind of humility. I rebuilt differently, more cautious with trust, more skeptical of the narratives that veil a person's complexity. We both became smaller and, in ways that are unbearably human, a little truer. There's a darkness that clings to revenge stories, one people like because it feels like justice wrapped in drama. But if there's any lesson in this, it is that justice is not the same as satisfaction. You can obtain the former and still be left empty-handed when it comes to the latter. I don't tell you this for absolution. I tell you this because the story changes you if you let it. If you take anything away from what I did and what followed, let it be this: the pursuit of reckoning can be righteous or cruel, but it will always, always cost you something in return. The camera would have been rolling if this were a confession video. If you were watching me live on YouTube, you might be waiting for the mic drop, the final flourish. There isn't one. There is only the quiet, persistent task of living with the version of yourself you've chosen to be. And as for the darkness, does it end? That's the last thing I'll leave hanging for you to decide. Because sometimes the real question isn't whether you would do it again, it's whether, having done it once, you can ever trust the person you became in the act. And that's how it all ended, or maybe, how it truly began. Life after revenge is never as simple as people think, and sometimes the scars we create run deeper than the ones we sought to heal. If you've been hooked by this story, don't just disappear into the silence, hit that like button, subscribe for more thrilling tales, and make sure to share this with someone who loves suspense as much as you do. And I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Do you think revenge was worth it, or did it cost me more than I ever imagined? Your thoughts could spark the next story.